The gladiator did not belong to himself. He was property with a pulse, a body that had been purchased, fed, trained, and maintained with the same calculated precision a merchant applies to his most profitable goods. Roman Lannisters, the men who owned and operated gladiatorial schools, kept records of their fighters. They were a modern franchise tracks its roster. A dead gladiator was a financial loss. A wounded one was a temporary setback. The goal was never heroism, it was return on investment. In this one, we're getting into the diet, the body conditioning, the deliberate wound management, and what it actually meant to keep a man alive just long enough to be worth watching die. Stay tuned, and if this is a kind of history that does not show up in your textbooks, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Isotope analysis conducted on gladiatorial skeletal remains, particularly from a burial site excavated in Ephesus, has given researchers a chemical window into what these men were actually eating. The results pointed overwhelmingly to a diet built around barley, beans, and dried fruit. This earned them the ancient nickname hoderi, meaning the barley men, and it was not a term of respect. The diet was engineered to produce a thick layer of subcutaneous fat sitting over dense muscle. That fat served a very specific function inside the arena. It acted as a buffer, allowing blades and instruments to cut through the surface of the skin and produce dramatic, visible wounds that bled well for the crowd without immediately severing arteries or destroying muscle tissues that would end the fight too soon. The body of a gladiator was essentially staged for performance. Trainers understood the anatomy of spectacle in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with durability. Wounds needed to be readable from the upper tiers of a packed amphitheater. They needed to bleed visibly, slow the fighter enough to create tension, but not drop him before the crowd had received what they paid for. This is why the conditioning was so specific. Lean fighters with low body fat bled differently. They went down faster. They were harder to keep alive through a fight that the editor, the man presiding over the games, wanted to extend for dramatic effect. The fat layer was essentially a production tool built into the body itself. The medical infrastructure around gladiators reflected the same logic. Galen, one of the most influential physicians in the ancient world, began his career treating gladiators for the Lannister of Pergamon. He was not there out of compassion. He was there because a healthy, fight-ready gladiator represented significant capital, and the Lannister needed someone who could repair that capital quickly and reliably. Galen later described the experience as the best surgical education available, precisely because the wounds were so frequent, so varied, and so deliberately managed that he encountered injuries in gladiators that most physicians would never see in a lifetime of civilian practice. When a gladiator went down and could not continue, the fight did not simply end. It moved into a second phase that was just as choreographed as the combat itself. The defeated fighter, if still alive, would raise a finger to signal submission and appeal to the editor for mercy. The editor would then read the crowd. If the audience wanted death, he gave them death. If they wanted the man spared, the fighter lived, at least until the next time. But when the decision was death, what followed was not a chaotic killing. It was actually a procedure. The fighter was expected to receive the death stroke with composure, kneeling upright, neck exposed, without flinching. A gladiator who died badly, who struggled or begged or collapsed out of position, dishonored himself in the only moment that the crowd would remember. The blade was typically driven down to the junction between the neck and the shoulder, targeting the subclavian vessels and the heart. It was chosen for speed and visual clarity. The crowd needed to see that death was real and that it had been accepted. Immediately after the killing stroke, a figure entered the arena dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. He carried a mallet and a red-hot iron. The mallet was used to strike the body. The iron was pressed against the skin to test for any reaction. This was not ritual for its own sake. It was actually a form of verification. Faking death in the arena was not unheard of, and the Lannister had every financial incentive to attempt it if a valuable fighter was on the losing end. The Charon figure was the system's answer to that possibility. A built-in check against fraud dressed up in mythology, so the crowd experienced it as a ceremony rather than quality control. Once death was confirmed, attendants entered and removed the body through the Porta Libitinensis, the gate of death, named for Libitina, the Roman goddess associated with funerals and corpses. The gate was a threshold in a very literal sense. On one side of it, the man was a gladiator, a name, a crowd favorite, a fighter with a record and a reputation. On the other side, he was a body under administration. His equipment was inventoried and returned to the school. His identity as a performer dissolved the moment he passed through that gate, and what remained was processed accordingly. What happened in those first minutes after removal was of mourning. Collectors and vendors were already positioned near the gate. Gladiator sweat had been scrapped from the skin during and after the fight using a carved iron tool called a strigil, and this material was bottled and sold. Roman medical texts and household records document gladiator sweat as a treatment rubbed into the skin for various ailments, and it carried particular value as an aphrodisiac applied by wealthy women. The blood was collected with similar urgency. It was used in treatments for epilepsy, a practice documented by Pliny the Elder, who described spectators rushing the arena floor to collect blood directly from the dying. The body, even in its final minutes, was a resource being actively harvested. The celebrity had died, but the commodity had one last transaction left in it. Thank you for watching. Until the next one.